So if you haven't been following the Miles Morales Spider-Man comic, he's getting new powers. And this comic is amazing. Oh my God. This deals with gods and spider totems, the web of life and destiny, all that cool stuff. Like Spider-Man ties into it, but so does Black Panther. So if you do need to get caught up and you want a more in-depth explanation of what's going on, there'll be a playlist at the end of this video that you can watch. But the long and short of this is that, as most of you guys know on Blood Hunt, Miles Morales was bitten by Blade, who was possessed. But in essence, Miles Morales is a vampire. And so Black Panther has brought him to Wakanda in order to try to find a way to cure him using the Panther goddess Bast. Now, one of the things about this, and I don't really know exactly how I feel about it, we don't really get to see a lot of Wakanda, and we never do, right? I mean, I guess in some ways we do, but like Wakanda's phenomenal, just in terms of how it looks and how it's depicted. But the fact is that what Black Panther tells Miles is they cannot just walk into the capital, and they cannot just simply go and have Miles enter into the realm of Bast, because it would draw too much attention. And that really kind of builds on the nature of Doom War. So for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with that story, and we'll kind of reference it a little bit as we get later on into this video, Doom War was a story where Dr. Doom had orchestrated a nationalist uprising in Wakanda in order to create a conflict over there, so nobody would pay attention to what was happening over here. What was happening over here? He was stealing all the vibranium in Wakanda. It's a phenomenal story, and we might remaster it just for the sake of having done it, because it's just a phenomenal story. It's incredible the way that it goes down. He becomes like godly powerful and all kinds of stuff. It's wild. But the fact is that what goes on here is that because of the fact that while Black Panther is the leader of Wakanda, he is also aware that ever since Doom War, and potentially even before Doom War, he just wasn't aware of it, there are those individuals in Wakanda that are looking for ways to basically cast him out as the leader and change out the entire monarchy with something else, whether it be a democratic society or it be just kind of like a dictatorship under the rule of some warlord. We don't definitively know. But because of this, what T'Challa has done is he's kind of created these essential back doors into the realm of Bast. One of these was given to a guy by the name of Niobe. And the idea here is that he would basically give Black Panther the key that was handed to Niobe previously that would give Black Panther the ability to secretly enter into the realm of Bast. The problem is that the key's missing. And so the result of this is that Panther tells Miles to calm his mind and to look around. Now, some of this is tied into the nature of the new vibranium suit that Miles was given, and some of it is tied into his existing vampiric powers, which is to say, the ability to calm his mind and to literally filter his surroundings, almost like Joel from The Last of Us, right? And figure out people's locations. It's not something that he's consistently done in the past. It has happened once or twice, but it is becoming a more focal point of his character as time goes on in the comics. So it is cool to see that Marvel's kind of expanding and building on this whole thing. Now, of course, Miles figures out where this person is, ultimately chases him down. But keep in mind, the nature of the suit is that it allows Miles to channel his venom energy into the suit, which kind of funnels back into him and brings him down from these amped up states. Because whenever his adrenaline gets going, his vampirism begins to hypen up and he starts to lose himself. It's not that dissimilar from like Wolverine's berserker state or Thor going into a warrior's madness. And so in order for Miles to calm down, he does get a little bit of assistance from Black Panther. It's kind of like, you know, calm yourself, relax, remember the nature of your suit. But it is mostly Miles, right? Kind of bringing himself back, calming himself down, getting back to a more central place. Now, this is kind of a undercurrent of what's going on in the Miles comics, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's a power, but most of you guys know who are huge fans of Miles Morales and have been for some time. I wouldn't go so far as to say that he's reckless, but I would go so far as to say that he doesn't have the best control of his emotions. He tends to get carried away. And so one of the undercurrents, maybe personality trait adjustments that's happening here, is Miles is effectively growing up, right? Learning emotional intelligence to a degree, understanding what it is that his triggers are that send him into a heightened state and then bringing himself back down. And so what we end up finding out from all of this was that it was actually all just a test. This person who stole works for Black Panther, and the idea was to send Miles on a wild hunt to make sure that he can still control himself, which, while it's not as good as it could be, it's better than it could be, right? So it's kind of like, okay, you are ready to meet Bast, and we'll let Bast decide whether or not you're worthy of being cured. Now, the other cool thing that goes on is there's a bit of a conversation here between T'Challa and Miles, where T'Challa asks, what do you know of Wakanda's traditions? Now, all Miles really knows is just kind of what he's heard tell, right? Spider-Man and other members of the Avengers, and this is what the Wakandans do, whether it was like the main focus of a conversation or just kind of some passing statement, but he doesn't really know with any measure of certainty because he's never really been here in any meaningful way. And that's why you hear things where he says, you guys have the best technology on the planet, and you're one of the richest nations as well. Now, I know a lot of you guys would say, well, no. Wakanda is the wealthiest nation in the world. They were, and that's where we kind of reference Doom War again, right? That at the end of the Doom War story, which I guess maybe this might be a bit of a spoiler, the events transpired in such a way to where vibranium was basically rendered inert. Vibranium has no value anymore, at least the Great Mound doesn't. And so while Wakanda does not derive its wealth from all the vibranium it has at its disposal, because now the Great Mound is just a giant chunk of rock. Instead, when they were ultra wealthy, they bought up the national debt of multiple countries. So those countries are going to pay them back forever. So sure, they're not as rich as they could be. Remove a zero from like a few trillions, and that's kind of where they are, right? Hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of wealth. So they're not broke. You know what I mean? Like it's one of those cool little elements. But the other thing that Black Panther says, and really kind of how he hints at the nature of Bast, is he says, I speak of things not found through online searches or Warren Avengers files. I speak of our tradition of communion, of unity. And that's where Miles asks, you're not going to ask me to repent for my sins, are you? And Black Panther says, I am not a priest, my friend, though if something weighs heavy on your mind, I welcome shouldering some of that burden. Now, here's the kicker here. Black Panther is technically a priest, but not a priest in the traditional sense, right? He's not a Catholic priest, right? You don't walk in there and say, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. And Black Panther's like, what'd you do, man? Like, it's not one of those things, right? He is a servant of the Panther goddess Bast, and he is the spiritual political leader of Wakanda itself. But again, he's more of like a herald for the Panther god Bast, not really a priest per se. Now, depending on how you want to look at it, you could argue they're effectively two sides of the same coin, and they're essentially the same thing, right? Moon Knight's not a priest, but he calls himself a priest, and he's a servant of Khonshu. So again, you kind of split the difference and make sense of it in a way that works for you. But one of the things that Miles talks about here is the feeling that he has as a result of what happened in Blood Hunt, being bitten by Blade, that he felt betrayed, right? Because Blade was a member of the Avengers, and I think to a degree he still is, but being possessed and turning against the Avengers, that Blade and Miles were very, very close. In fact, Miles helped Blade on more than a few missions and actually became close with his daughter. One of the big kickers about all of this is that there was a kind of communion that was found there, because while Blade is part and parcel to the main Marvel universe, he's always kind of been there and separate at the same time, with the exception of like a couple instances, right, where he initially came into contact with Wolverine in his early days, when Blade was bitten by Morbius, which is what allows Blade to walk around in the daylight, that by and large, he doesn't really have a lot of crossings over into the main Marvel universe. The Midnight Suns is another example of that, but he's usually just kind of over there. Miles found common ground with Blade in that feeling, because Miles comes from a whole different universe. He's made the main Marvel universe his home, but he comes from the original Ultimate Universe. So no matter how close he gets to the people here, no matter what loves he may develop or what home he builds for himself, it will never truly be home. You know what I mean? Like, it's just one of those little feelings that he kind of has itching. But more so than that, because he and Blade were so close and Blade was able to attack him, he's kind of plagued with these questions. What if he had bitten my girlfriend, my parents, my younger sister, you, or some poor person on the street? It's these fears and this anger that he feels from allowing himself to be so vulnerable to somebody that he knew that took advantage of that. But it's also kind of reconciling these things, right? Blade was possessed by a vampire god. Blade was not his normal self. But one of the important things that T'Challa says here is, fear is not something to be ashamed of, my friend. or anger. It is natural. It allows us to survive. However, living in the past and what ifs is the quickest way a fool will find themselves in a prison. And that's true, right? There's two messages that he's giving him here. The first one is what you're feeling is normal. You're a human being first and a man second. Do not forget that, right? There are normal aspects of what it means to be human, to fear, to love, to hate. Emotions really are just a natural human thing. But the other part of that is, yes, the past is a prison. The past is not meant to be dwelled in. The past is meant to be learned from. Because if you allow yourself to live in the past, then you allow yourself to be plagued by what ifs. What if I had done this differently? What if I had done that differently? How might things have transpired? And because there are a million things that happens over the course of our lives leading up to any one particular point in time, there are an even million more what ifs on how things could have been different. And your imagination becomes your prison. So it's one of these things where it's like, live in the moment, stop worrying about what happened before, learn from it, understand the circumstances, and move forward, right? He says, regrets are for those too afraid to live in the present. It's something the dead tell me all too often. And as their king, I can do nothing but listen. And so what they end up doing is getting to the field where the Panther goddess Bast presents herself. Now, we are going to see a bit of a change in terms of how Bast shows herself to people within this Black Panther mythos, because again, Marvel Comics copies the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's not the other way around anymore, which really begs the question, what's Marvel Comics going to do when the MCU stops making movies? And so when Bast presents herself to Miles, the initial kind of presentation here is, are you even worthy of my attention? Now, this is not a fight. It's not a knockdown, drag out conflict between the two. That comes later. In the here and now, it is Bast reading the soul of Miles Morales, reading what it is that makes him who he is, what he plagues himself with, how he views himself, how he's treated people over the course of his life. She's quite literally judging his very humanity. Now, of course, ultimately he passes, and that leads to her traveling back to a kind of realm, and then Black Panther following suit. And this is where you get that kind of copy from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We are introduced to the Bashia Rui. Now, here's the thing about this, is that in Marvel Comics in the past, there wasn't really any instance of anything like this existing. This only exists because of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. When it came to encounters with Bast, Bast would present herself to you. Very rarely would you ever actually go to the realm of Bast. And in fact, I imagine we could probably count on one hand the number of times that's happened, if it's ever happened at all. But Bast appearing to you, that's what happened in Doom War, when Dr. Doom met Bast. Bast appearing to Black Panther when he became King of the Dead in the aftermath of Doom War. All these things are Bast appearing to people, but she is part of a much larger pantheon of gods that exist out there. And so that's where, when Miles says, like, you know, are you going to be able to cure me here? Black Panther says, well, it's going to require a lot more than that, right? It's going to require the power of Bast herself. I cannot do it for you. Now, of course, Shuri shows up here as well. And again, Shuri in the comics is basically being adapted to become the version of herself from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Don't necessarily know how I feel about that, because if you read Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, Shuri is amazing. Like, when she becomes the Black Panther, she is a boss. Like, that version is the version that should have been in the MCU, not the other way around. Right? They are different in a lot of ways. But the cool thing here is that ultimately it's like, okay, let's begin this kind of, I wouldn't call it like an incantation, but basically this process in order to get Miles over to the other side so Miles can communicate with Bast. Now, part of this involves taking the heart-shaped herb. The other part is opening a doorway so Miles can get in. And so when the whole thing is cast, Miles wakes up within the realm of Bast. And she's like, do you really show up here to my doorstep not knowing who it belongs to? Now, one of the things about Bast as a character is that Bast is fair, but Bast is also very haughty and proud at the same time. Which, would you really expect anything other than a goddess that represents cats? Right? I mean, you know, I'm just saying. But she is very, very proud. And that's why you don't want to ingratiate yourself to Bast and say, I am not worthy of your greatness. But at the same time, you don't want to be arrogant. And that's why whenever Black Panther speaks with Bast, he speaks with respect, but confidence at the same time. And so it's why when she's like, who is it that would bring an outsider to my domain? Why would you do this? And the response of Black Panther is, I do not understand. I mean no offense by our presence here, right? He doesn't throw himself down on the ground. Forgive us, Lord Bast. We are not worthy of your greatness, and please see our... No, 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 no. That's not what you do, because then she will probably destroy you just for irritating her. You know what I mean? So like, you don't really do that kind of thing. And so that's where Bast says, no offense is given. And she says, and yet offense is given. And that's where T'Challa remains standing on his feet with confidence. Forgive our transgressions here. It is not my intention to insult, merely to help the boy. And even Miles speaks up and says, yes, this is true, right? He's only trying to help. Now understand, this is not the first time that Black Panther has brought someone before Bast. And so for her to react the way that she is now has less to do with the fact that Miles was brought here and has more to do with the other god that Miles represents. I say that because, again, if you guys remember from Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run, when Black Panther became the King of the Dead, he brought Reed Richards as a witness to Black Panther's standing, right? To his character, to the validity of what Black Panther really stands for, right? And kind of ushering in this new era of his life, so to speak, right? Following Shuri becoming Black Panther at the end of Doom War. And so ultimately, with Miles being brought here, despite being represented by another god, it's considered a transgression, because when it comes to these various gods, and we've seen them with, like, Sidorak, right? The guy who gave Juggernaut his powers and so on and so forth. You do not receive a gift from a god and then, quote unquote, secretly travel to another god and ask for a gift. It's considered offensive, right? You just don't do that sort of thing. But Miles doesn't know what they're talking about, because Miles does not know about the Spider-Man mythos. If this was Peter Parker, that would have been nipped in the bud right off the bat. He would have said, okay, look, we can do that, Black Panther, but there's something I need to go take care of first. And that's assuming he would even be allowed to do it. And so what I'm talking about here is the great Anansi. Now, this is a really, really cool thing, because a lot of you guys have heard of the Web of Life and Destiny. A lot of you guys know about the Inheritors, Spider-Verse, all that kind of stuff. But for those of you guys who haven't, for years in Marvel Comics, Peter Parker was just a dude who was bitten by a radioactive spider, and then he got some powers. And that was it. That's really all it was. But once you got to J. Michael Straczynski's run, you got to Dan Slott's run, you started learning that when Peter Parker was bitten by a radioactive spider, that he effectively became a herald for the spider god Anansi. Not only that, everyone everywhere across the multiverse who's ever been bitten by a radioactive spider is a harbinger for Anansi, a herald, a representative of Anansi, whether they know it or not. And so the reason why this is so important is because this ties into the nature of the greater Spider-Man mythos, that he says things like, I am the great spider, weaver of stories, of legend, of myth and song. Mine is a host that expands worlds and realities and universes, a reverberation of a string plucked on my web, no matter how distant, always finds its way back to me. Do you understand, my champion, my Spider-Man? Now, what he's talking about here is the Web of Life and Destiny. And a lot of people try to figure out a way to reconcile the Web of Life and Destiny with the greater multiverse, how it all ties together, how it fits in with things like the M'Kraan Crystal and the Negative Zone and so on and so forth. The easiest way to understand the Web of Life and Destiny in Marvel Comics is not so much that it is a replacement for the multiverse, but it simply represents one part of the multiverse. Things like the M'Kraan Crystal are more like a hallway of doors of the multiverse, right? So you can enter in and out of any universe across the multiverse if you can travel and survive in the white hot room of the M'Kraan Crystal. When it comes to something like the Web of Life and Destiny, it's easier to think of it as like the Force from Star Wars, but only pertaining to spider people. So these threads that exist out there are all kind of tying these spider people together. And the threads represent realities or individual people and things like that. And there are certain roles within the Web of Life and Destiny that individuals kind of occupy that represent certain things. So a good example of that is the Bride, right? Cindy Moon. She's going to be coming up in the new Insomniac Spider-Man game, although we haven't really seen anything from her in Marvel for a while, I don't believe. But Cindy Moon was the bride. What does that mean? It means within the web of life and destiny, there's only one bride, and the bride represents individuals who are bitten by radioactive spiders and become Spider-Man and Spider-Women by happenstance, luck, or sometimes bad luck, right? They're in the wrong place at the wrong time and they get bitten by a spider. So it's not as though every spider person out there was somehow destined to become a spider person with a hero's mantra or anything like that. They just happened to be in a place and they were bitten by a spider. And that's really it. But that is what the web of life and destiny represents. Now, it does have its own origin story with a character named Neith and so on and so forth. We don't have to get into that here. I feel like it'll just kind of oversaturate the video. So we can make a video on that if you're interested. But getting back to this, right? Getting back to this main point here, that because of the fact that Miles is representative of another god, this is not an easily solvable equation, because the reality here is that Anansi does not have the power to cure Miles of his vampirism. Bast does, and even Bast wasn't able to do it on her own. Bast needed help in doing this, presumably from even Anansi himself. We don't necessarily know. But the other thing here is that because there has been a transgression, that transgression needs to be resolved. More so than that, if Miles is going to prove himself worthy of being cured of his vampirism, that worth will be determined by the spider god himself, not by Bast. And so in order to kind of solve both these problems at the same time, that they agree that this whole series of trials that Miles will undergo will start with a fight. It'll start with a battle. And the battle will be the representative of Bast versus the representative of the spider god, i.e. Miles Morales has to fight the Black Panther. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. I'm leaving you guys on a massive cliffhanger. I told you the comic was fantastic. Like, the Miles Morales comic is amazing right now. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Should we continue this? You guys don't want me to continue this. You guys don't want it. We'll just drop it. You guys don't want me to continue this. But thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.